It's no surprise to learn that education is one of the key issues in pretty much every election for the last 2 years and probably for the next 5 to 10 years. It should be. But what is surprising is suddenly Republicans and conservatives are owning that issue. Just look at the governor's race in Virginia last year when Republican Glenn Youngkin won statewide, actually a sweep, all three statewide offices. Governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general went to Republicans for the first time in nearly a decade. Why? Because of the education issue. One of the leading voices for education reform coming from Virginia was Ian Pryor and the parents movement in Loudoun County, Virginia. And he's got a brand new book out now, Parents of the World Unite, How to Save Our Schools from the Left's Radical Agenda. Ian Pryor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
You've had the book out for a day now, #1 on Amazon in education reform, and it's #1 across the board for, #2 across the board for education in general. #1, I think, is like flashcards for homeschoolers. So basically, you're #1 there too. I mean, that tells you people are hungry. Parents, taxpayers, citizens of this country are hungry to learn about what you were able to do in Virginia.
Yeah, that's right. And I really designed this book to tell the story about what happened in Loudoun County and Virginia overall, to almost give a manual. Sun Tzu's Art of War for Parents, which, as I say, is going to get me flagged by Merrick Garland, but so be it. It's structured in 12 chapters, with each chapter being a rule or a philosophy that we followed throughout our fight. As you know very well, I mean, we really had to organize, and we were constantly thinking about, how do we outwork our opposition? How do we outthink our opposition? How do we outnumber our opposition? And how do we outcommunicate our opposition? And, we were able to really pull from, a lot of different parents with a lot of different skill sets throughout the community, and maximize those skill sets as a team. And that made us, very nimble. It made us very strategic. And when you're dealing with a, $1.6 billion bureaucracy, on one hand, it seems intimidating. But on the other hand, they're cumbersome. They're slow. They're not as smart as they think they are. And you can really outflank them on a lot of these issues, which is what we were able to do.
Well, they're also rather complacent and arrogant, frankly, because they're quite sure that they're right and they've got the political clout to defeat you. Tell me a little bit, Ian Pryor, about the genesis and then evolution of this movement, because if I remember right, it started with parents fed up with their kids still learning on a laptop, over a year into the pandemic, when students in even New York City, let alone Florida and Texas, were back in the classroom. These parents still had to deal with the learning loss that their kids were suffering. That started it, but boy, then it evolved into what they were learning, the curriculum, the transgender policies. It started this domino effect.
It really did. And you do have to start in the summer of 2020, where there are, groups of parents that were really organized around the open schools movement. And so they'd go to school board meetings, they'd write to their legislator. They were really pushing for the schools to open. And, the schools generally didn't listen to them. And that created a lot of frustration. At the same time, you had other parents that were looking at, what kids were actually learning. They were looking over at their Chromebooks and seeing, well, wait a minute, why are you being told that you're an oppressor when you're, 7 years old? I don't get it. And I ended up writing about that. I ended up writing about the Equity Collaborative and how they did this $500,000 equity audit on Loudoun County Public Schools. I wrote a piece in the Federalist, but then things really exploded in March of 2021. When you had the anti-racist parents of Loudoun County create a private Facebook group, which had dozens of teachers, administrators, 6 school board members, Soros-backed prosecutor, and they wanted to really cancel parents that were insufficiently woke and went to speak at school board meetings. They wanted to infiltrate their groups, publicly expose them. One woman even suggested hacking their websites and redirecting them to pro-critical race theory websites. Well, the script was flipped on them because ultimately it was their group that was infiltrated and they were publicly exposed. And that right there was, I think, the moment where parents got together, open schools parents, other parents looking at the curriculum, parents that were on that list, and said, all right, it's time for us to mobilize and push back against this school system.
The book is called Parents of the World Unite. It certainly started locally. Now it's become national and international, this movement, as we realize what professional educators have done children in organized schools, Ian. And I remember I was fortunate enough to be able to interview you and talk about this issue locally in Washington, D.C. on my radio station, WMAL. And I remember getting some pushback. It's like, why aren't you talking about Trump and Biden and January 6th and COVID and Fauci and all of these things? Because a lot of listeners, a lot of people, I think they got used to conservative commentators just talking about these big national issues. And I think that became part of the problem, and that we lost sight of what was going on in our own neighborhoods and our own backyards.
Yeah, 100% that was part of the problem. So many people focus on what's going on at the national level, what's going on with, the president or Congress, but they lose sight of what is happening at their local school boards. And it's been this way for a long time. And I myself am one of those individuals. In 2019, I didn't vote in the school board elections. I thought, oh, you just send your kids to school, the teachers are great and everything's fine, and it'll be just like when I was a kid. But you learn quickly that that's not the case. And I do remember that first conversation with you. I think it was right after we announced that we were going to try and remove school board members through a court process. And I was sitting in my car right after the press conference. And it was important that it got local coverage, because I think everybody in Northern Virginia, and certainly Virginia overall, saw what was going on. And when you start to go after, people's children, when you start to go after people, in their communities, in their neighborhoods, for really just stating what they believe and trying to argue on policy points, that's going to infuriate a lot of people, not just conservatives, independents as well. And I think that's what we saw in Virginia, and that's what we're starting to see all over the country.
But Ian, it certainly became a national issue and a presidential issue pretty quickly. As you mentioned, Merrick Garland's Justice Department. Parents who came to these school board meetings ended up on lists as potential domestic terrorists. An FBI unit began investigating. And we've now learned from the House Judiciary Committee releasing information from their investigation that there was a partnership between the Biden White House, between the Justice Department, and between this organization that represented school boards nationally. So, I mean, they take this very seriously. They don't like you, Ian. They don't like you getting uppity and saying that maybe we should take back our schools.
Well, they certainly did. And in that report, I mean, it specified that, this was in reaction to what was happening in Virginia, which was clearly hurting Terry McAuliffe. Now, Terry McAuliffe didn't help himself by saying, I don't think parents should be telling schools what to teach. And of course, nobody's saying that parents want to be in charge of the calculus curriculum. But what we were saying is that schools deal with academics, parents deal with social and moral issues. And unfortunately, what we've seen in our schools is it's become reversed, whereas parents have to spend the time catching their children up on academics, because schools are wasting so much of their time, learning time, on these other issues, whether it's, critical race theory inspired concepts, or gender ideology, or everybody can change their sex depending on how they feel in a given day. And, that is not what the majority of the country wants. And ultimately, schools have to cut corners doing that, and they end up violating all sorts of laws and rules as they do.
Yeah, one of the most debilitating things in our society over the last 10 years is the American people feeling hopeless, whether it comes from shady election rules and voting rules and ballots, or district attorneys or attorney generals picking and choosing who to enforce a law. The same law is going to be enforced differently based on your political setup. What your book does, Ian, I think, is give people that hope again, that they actually can start making a difference. Real quickly here in our final minute, what's the big takeaway? What do people need to know as to why they need to get this book so that they can feel like they can harness that energy and take back their country again?
Well, if you're going to go out there and you're going to do this work and you're going to fight back, you really have to know how to do it. You have to employ strategies, tactics. You have to be very, objective about what you're doing. Don't always be emotional. Yes, this is an emotional topic, but there are ways to approach it, especially when you're dealing with, the far left and their woke allies. I mean, they can be vicious, but if you're smarter, if you outthink them, then you're going to be able to be successful. And this is not a fight that's going to be won over 3 years, but it's a fight that's going to take, a long investment of time and resources to undo what the left has done to our education system for decades. But I do see hope on the horizon.
But in the meantime, Ian, you're making a change for your own children's education and your neighbor's children's education, and it's good to signal to your kids that you care that much, that you get involved. And I truly do believe, ultimately, you change your neighborhoods, you change your schools, you change your cities. That's how you change the country, bottom up, not top down. That's why we like Ian Pryor. He's a fighter, and you got to get his book so you can fight alongside him. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.